Bugün Türkiye'nin en fazla konuşulan konu Cumhuriyet gazetesine yönelik operasyon.
Turmoil in Turkey's opposition newspaper Cumhuriyet this morning after its editor and
Cumhuriyet gazetesinin bazı çalışanlarına
say that essentially what we're seeing right now from the Turkish government is a coup against democracy.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. The post-coup cloud that looms over the Turkish media. Will it ever end? How many news outlets remain to be shut down? An exhibition of solidarity over the Serbian government's approach to journalism. All is not as it seems. The government in Venezuela has developed a fascination for paperwork. It's using it as a pretense to lock journalists out. And birthday celebrations for Al Jazeera Arabic, Al Jazeera English, and the medium that grew into the message. The Turkish media landscape has, in the less than 4 months since the failed coup, been transformed, reduced. This past week, another 15 media operations were shut down, most of them in the predominantly Kurdish southeast. The total number of shuttered media outlets has risen to more than 160. One of Turkey's oldest newspapers, Cumhuriyet, which has already seen a former editor flee to Germany, has just had its current editor taken into custody, along with a dozen of his staff. Prosecutors are saying that Cumhuriyet has been committing crimes on behalf of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, as well as having ties to the network of Fethullah Gulen, the man the government says was behind the attempted coup. The state has yet to provide the evidence. The arrests and closures are all made possible by the state of emergency that was recently extended into next year. It allows the government to bypass parliament, rule by decree, and suspend rights and freedoms. And there's not a great deal that Turkey's media regulators, who are supposed to protect the independence of the news media, can do about it. This is a story of ever-increasing numbers of media closures and steadily decreasing numbers of news sources. Our starting point this week is the Turkish capital, Ankara. Most forms of journalism consist of words and images. But when it comes to the state of the news media in Turkey, it is the numbers that paint a picture. They tell the story. According to a site called TurkeyPurge.com, which says it aims to keep track of what it calls the witch hunt that followed the failed coup, 186 media outlets have been shut down. 133 media workers have been arrested. And the number of journalists thrown out of work, according to the Turkish Journalists Union, is between 2,000 and 3,000.
These numbers are correct, or there might even be more. I can't give an exact number because every day there are so many raids, attacks, and detentions on media outlets. It's hard to keep track. But if we look at the picture painted by the numbers, it does reflect the reality.
Yes, those figures are representative of reality. Also, the matter about press passes is true. People are being informed by text message that their press passes have been annulled. The Director General of the Press and Information Office has no authorization to cancel press passes in this way.
Cezaevinde 100'den fazla gazetecinin olduğunu tahmin.
There are more than 100 journalists in jail at the moment, but there is another figure. It's not just the number of journalists in jail, it's the number of journalists who work like they are in jail. I'm talking here about censorship and self-censorship. That takes the numbers up into the thousands. So the picture is clear. No media outlet in Turkey can survive without siding with the AK party. Now there are only a handful of papers left, and there aren't strong enough alternative voices to stand up to government pressure. Soon there will be closures there too.
Evet doğrudur ve daha da artacak.
Ahmet Sik could have been talking about his own paper, Cumhuriyet. This past week, the authorities arrested 13 journalists there, including the editor. The paper then printed a front page headlined, "We will not surrender," and left blank 2 spaces, usually filled by columnists taken into custody. However, the employees there and the protesters who came out to support them know that given all the forced media closures, Cumhuriyet may be living on borrowed time, especially with prosecutors now alleging that the secular center-left paper has committed crimes on behalf of Gulenists, a socio-religious movement accused of masterminding the failed coup. It's a scenario that the head of Turkey's print regulator says is realistic.
Bundan çok kısa bir süre önceye kadar, belli bir süre.
Until a little while ago, Cumhuriyet was bankrupt. I have friends who worked there who said that salaries were either lowered or not paid at all. Then there was a change in the paper's management and suddenly all salaries were paid. We all knew the owners didn't have much money and yet bundles of money, as if in sacks, started pouring into Cumhuriyet.
Nasıl oldu da?
How has a struggling newspaper suddenly transformed? Prosecutors are looking for Gulen fingerprints.
FETÖ parmağı arıyorlar.
Bu sefer de Gülen cemaati
Now this newspaper stands accused of being a supporter of the Gulen movement. A newspaper like Cumhuriyet, as old as the republic itself, accused of being separatist or trying to bring down the government with a coup. Their logic and reasoning is inexplicable. If Turkey was run by the rule of law, there would be no such investigation. But there won't be any legal obstacles since the justice system has surrendered to a mafia-like government.
bir sonuç çıkacağını da düşünmüyorum soruşturmalardan.
The government has fewer and fewer legal obstacles to deal with, given the state of emergency it declared after the coup, and recently extended until January, which allows it to sidestep parliament and rule by decree. And the emergency conditions also enable the government to go over the head of Turkey's media regulators, the bodies that are supposed to deal with news outlets.
O hal kapsamındaki
Closures under emergency rule are different than at any other time, surely. This is the case in other parts of the world. In France, the emergency rule has been in place for over a year and a half now. The police there are able to detain people differently than they do under normal circumstances. This is the right of democratic governments.
tanınmış bir hak olarak düşünmek lazım.
We also queried regulators at RTÜK, the Turkish Broadcast Authority. They took issue with our line of questioning, but defended the legality of the closures and again likened the situation in Turkey to France. That might be a valid comparison if France had shut down 186 media outlets, or even one. Only it hasn't. Here's the Turkish Prime Minister responding to criticism from the EU this past week.
Basın özgürlüğüne sonuna kadar sahip çıkacağız.
And here's the reaction from the editor of a Kurdish news agency, JINHA, that the government just shut down upon being informed of the Prime Minister's words. Ever since the coup, critics have said the government's response has been wildly disproportionate, that it smacks of political opportunism. Primarily targeted on the media side have been outlets deemed to be Gulenist. However, the net was quickly widened to include Kurdish news outlets and their reporters. Until it was ordered closed this past week, JINHA was the only news agency of its kind, Kurdish and all-female. Last year, one of its journalists was arrested. She may be the only reporter ever jailed anywhere for being too excitable.
I was arrested for looking too excited on the 16th of December 2015. The only reason I was looking excited was because I was reporting the news and I love doing my job. Maybe it's the most tragically comical event of the past 10 years, and it shows the current condition of the law in this country.
Almost everything that is happening to the media in Turkey today is happening on illegal foundations. It is well known that these closures are unconstitutional, but under the state of emergency, everything, including the violation of the constitution and the law, is being permitted.
The government, its regulators, and its supporters argue they have the law on their side, and they're using it. This past Friday, new developments, an escalation, with the arrest of senior members of the pro-Kurdish opposition party, the HDP. Kurds in the southeast, who already have far fewer news sources than before, went online only to learn that their internet access had been denied or slowed to a crawl. Almost 4 months into the state of emergency, the Turkish media space seems to grow darker by the day, and there's no sign that the crackdown has run its course. Other media stories that are on our radar this week. The steady string of leaked emails on Hillary Clinton revealed by Julian Assange and WikiLeaks has claimed a second casualty, a Democratic Party operative, and has also exposed some of the perils of news networks and their use of, quote, political contributors, unquote. On October 31st, CNN announced that it is severing ties with Dona Brazil, the interim chair of the Democratic Party's National Committee.
Hillary Clinton has a lifetime commitment to supporting women and girls.
Brazil was one of many politicos hired by CNN and other U.S. networks to act as surrogates for the presidential candidates. CNN dumped Brazil just hours after WikiLeaks released an email from March in which she appears to pass on a question for an upcoming CNN-sponsored debate to the Clinton campaign so that the candidate could prepare for it. It was the second time Brazil was accused of sharing CNN debate questions in advance. But it's a confusing story in that a CNN spokesperson said the network never gave Brazil access to any questions in advance of a debate. But CNN said that we are completely uncomfortable with what we have learned about her interactions with the Clinton campaign while she was a CNN contributor. Dona Brazil has been the head of the DNC, the Democratic Party's executive body, ever since the former chairman, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, was forced to step down after WikiLeaks revealed that she was biased in favor of the Clinton campaign, which has since hired her. The Venezuelan government keeps finding new and not necessarily innovative ways to keep foreign journalists out of the country and away from the story of the unfolding power struggle there. On October 31st, border authorities denied Washington Post reporter Joshua Partlow entry at the airport in Caracas, allegedly for lacking a required work permit. Venezuela has had a journalist's permit law in place ever since 2004, but has only started to enforce it in the past few months as reporters try to get in to cover the mounting political and economic turmoil in the country. This past week also saw 4 Peruvian journalists stopped at the airport, held for more than 24 hours, then deported again for not having their paperwork in place. And an ABC News correspondent, Matt Gutman, was trying to do a medical story at a hospital in Valencia when he was arrested, held for 3 days, and deported back to the U.S. The New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists said journalists should be able to cover the story with government protection, not with harassment and interference by the government. Police in the Canadian province of Quebec are having to answer questions about why they've been spying on journalists, in one case hunting down sources on a story about police corruption. The first reporter to reveal that he had been targeted was Patrick Lagasse, who works for a paper called La Presse, when he said that the police in Montreal had tracked the columnist's phone, including calls, texts, and GPS locations. The surveillance was part of an internal police probe into an officer suspected of leaking confidential information regarding allegations that the Montreal police had fabricated evidence in some gang and drug investigations. Police Chief Philippe Pichet said, "This is an exceptional situation. We are very conscientious about the importance of respecting the freedom of the press." 3 days after that, this case began to look less exceptional when the Quebec Provincial Police also admitted to monitoring the phones of another 6 journalists in 2013, including reporters with La Presse, Le Journal de Montréal, and the state-owned Radio-Canada. La Presse's deputy managing editor, Eric Trottier, said the surveillance was an unequivocal attack against the institution of La Presse and against the entire journalistic profession. Serbia has seen more than its share of political change over the past 15 years or so, and the state of the news media there remains a work in progress. Under the former president, the late Slobodan Milosevic, the media were tightly controlled. Since then, power has changed hands multiple times, and these days, under Prime Minister Aleksandar Vučić, the methods of media control are more sophisticated. The government and its supporters say that the media are free, whereas critics argue that the government influences editorial lines in various ways, including through the parceling out of advertising revenues, either directly from the state or from institutions friendly to the state. No matter how you slice it, those critics say it amounts to a form of censorship. There is another significant source of media funding in Serbia that comes from the European Union. And the EU's idea of quality journalism differs from that of the Vučić government. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now from Belgrade on the censorship debate in Serbia.
Belgrade, October 5th, 2000, the day President Slobodan Milosevic was overthrown. He was destined for The Hague and a war crimes trial at the International Criminal Court. He was found dead in his cell before facing judgment. Members of Milosevic's former government remained in Serbia, Information Minister Aleksandar Vučić among them. Vučić is now the Prime Minister. His Serb party, the SNS, took power in 2014, and critics say that media freedom has been on the decline ever since.
The environment is not conducive to the full exercise of freedom of expression. There are still some shortcomings. For example, journalists with very little job security and very low salaries that are prone to pressure.
Criticizing Aleksandar Vučić can result in losing your job. There are plenty of examples. Olja Bećković's famous show Impression of the Week on the B92 channel had a large audience and was commercially successful, but it was cancelled. Recently, the Politika Daily, which is majority state-owned, terminated the contract of the cartoonist Dusan Petricic after he drew caricatures of Vučić.
The media landscape has changed fundamentally since the Milosevic era. The airwaves have opened up, newsstands have many more newspapers to sell, and Serbians have access to digital information. But it's the quality of that information that is at issue, with a growing number of journalists saying that, in one way or another, they are censored. The Prime Minister and his party disagree, and they have put their side of the argument on display through an exhibition called Uncensored Lies, which features selected examples of negative coverage over the last 3 years about the government. The exhibition first opened to the Serbian public in Belgrade.
More and more we heard the criticism of censorship. So-called censorship, they would say there is no freedom in Serbia, you cannot write about SNS or Prime Minister. So we wanted to show people, how it really looks like. How could you write in almost every newspaper so many negative things about us if there is a censorship? You just said this was written about us, and just without any comment from the party, we wanted to show you this and to ask you, do you feel that there is a censorship in Serbia?
After Belgrade, the exhibition made its way south to Kruševac. When we got there, it soon became clear that preparations had been made for our arrival. When we arrived here, the exhibition was empty, but mysteriously the place has filled up, and everyone here seems happy to talk to us, to tell us how great this exhibition is and how well it demonstrates that there's a free press in Serbia.
Bilo je krajnje vrijeme da se u javnost pokaže nešto oko, da se ljudima kaže šta je laž, šta je istina.
Dobar je napadno svasti i više nego što jedna demokratska zemlja ima, znači da ne postoji cenzura medijska.
Na osnovu svega ovoga što možemo da ovdje vidimo i što je prikazano, svakako da nema.
And then, as quickly as the exhibition had filled up, it emptied. If the goal was to show public support for the government's approach to the media, then it lacked subtlety, much like the exhibition itself. Rather than providing evidence of a free press in Serbia, journalist associations say that it is the pinnacle of cynicism, starting with the name, Uncensored Lies.
The problem with the current ruling party and its allies is that they do not understand a basic premise. Not all negative reports or criticism about those in power should be considered a lie. The name of the exhibition, Uncensored Lies, shows how those in power do not understand the clear difference between lies and criticism.
This exhibition derives from the idea that news outlets that criticize the government and the politics of Aleksandar Vučić do so not because it's their job, but because they are paid or bribed, either by the West or some internal enemy.
Watching all of this from Brussels is the European Union. As a candidate for EU membership, Serbia has received 1.2 billion euros in funding from the EU between 2007 and 2013. Over the last 15 years, 32 million euros has gone into the media. And this year, an estimated 5.2 million euros will go to news outlets that focus on investigative journalism. Among the news reports on display at the exhibition is an investigative story written by Alexander Georgievich. He works for the Burn Project, an investigative news outlet that gets most of its money from the EU. The story revealed irregularities in the awarding of a state tender, which possibly cost taxpayers 120 million euros. The EU deemed the story to be award-winning investigative journalism. Serbia's interior minister put it another way. He said that he could not believe that the EU would fund a news outlet that lies.
It's a really question for EU. I mean, why did you award the journalists that wrote lies about something that was fair and honest government business in saving people's lives? That's a question. Was that just for, let's say, trying to write something that will be negative in order to get attention of the public? Or you had some other plans?
The rules under which we support the independent media are extremely clear. We do not intervene into editorial policy in any way, which in turn means that the views presented by those who win the grants are theirs alone.
Setting aside the issue of EU funds, the importance of which has been greatly exaggerated, EU officials have a quite tolerant attitude towards Alexander Vučić and the way that he treats the media. This is because EU officials are not interested in the media so long as Vučić fulfills his main political tasks relating to the Kosovo Agreement, regional stability and other strategic issues. When it comes to issues deemed important to the West, his treatment of the media stays in the background.
While some Serbian news outlets have alternative funding options, the majority need advertising to survive. The private sector ad spend is around 150 million euros a year, and it may be tainted by politics. Again, according to a Burn investigation, private advertisers in Serbia deal with advertising agencies, intermediaries, that then allocate which news outlets get advertising. According to the investigation, the biggest agency in the country has close ties to the government.
They inherited this system from the previous ruling party. The owner of the biggest private advertising agency was Dragan Đilas, the mayor of Belgrade and one of the most influential people in the country. When the new government came to power, the company was taken over by the best friend of Alexander Vučić. What we are seeing is the continuation of politically controlled advertising.
The state is financing censorship. It is subsidizing favorable media outlets and does its best to keep money away from critical ones. Media outlets face a dilemma. Their editorial policies must glorify Alexander Vučić, or they will lose funds and be forced to shut down.
In the final days of the Milosevic era, the media were an issue in Serbia. RTS, the state-owned broadcaster, was derided as a government mouthpiece and attacked by protesters who helped dismantle, symbolically, the government's media apparatus. Times have changed. So have the players and some of the tactics. But make no mistake, the pro-government media machine is being rebuilt. And in making its case, exhibiting its position, the Serbian government of Alexander Vučić is showing its hand, its true colors.
Finally, this past week, television turned 80 years old. It's been that long since the first experimental live broadcast took place in London. Another TV experiment. Al Jazeera's Arabic news channel just turned 20 years old on November 1st. And the channel you're watching right now, Al Jazeera English, has its 10th birthday coming up later this month. Normally, we don't make a habit of self-celebration at Al Jazeera, but we will make an exception on this occasion, and we promise it won't happen again for another 20 years. Well, maybe 10. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
أهلا بكم.